Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this event this morning. We're really honored to have Bill Janeway with us today to talk about, in part, his book, but in general, his thoughts on sort of economics and where we are today, both in terms of the economy and also in terms of economics. Bill, as you know, is the author of this really wonderful book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. I read this book, probably not right when it came out, but I read it last year and was just so impressed with it, in part because we live in a world where there's a sort of small cadre of people who believe in the sort of way we think about the economy that's really Schumpeterian. It's disrupted all the time. There's really no equilibrium. And innovation and entrepreneurship are big drivers of it. And there aren't really a lot of economists who think that way. There are certainly a few, and I think the number are growing, but there aren't a lot of people who articulated that in the way Bill has, in part because I think of his background, as you'll see in just a second, of being both a PhD economist, but also somebody who's tilled in the fields of venture capital and really the real world of innovation. So what we're going to do is we will hear from Bill for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a lively discussion with all of us until no later than 10:30. One thing before I introduce him, just for fun, we created this web test about 3 years ago. We had about 20,000 people take it. But it's kind of fun. It's what's your economic type, and it takes you 10 minutes to do it. It's about 20 questions. It's not questions like what is the difference between a Keynesian and a this, or who was John Baptiste Say. It's not questions like that. It's just questions like if the government has $1 billion, what would you do with it, kind of questions. But in any case, it's fun to take. It's at innovationeconomics.org/type. I encourage you to do that. At the end of it, you find out what kind of what's your economic type, and you have a picture of Art Laffer is one type, Bob Rubin is another type, Keynes is another type, and Schumpeter is another type. I know Michael's taken it, and I won't divulge your type, Michael, because that's private, I'm sure, but we can all guess. So anyway, just to get underway, Bill Janeway is the senior advisor at Warburg Pincus. He joined that firm in 1988 and was responsible for building the information technology investment practice. He had been executive vice president director of Eberstadt Fleming. It actually goes through some of the book. One of the things I think that's interesting about the book is it's a quasi-biography. It talks about his career. He's also director of Magnet Systems, Nuance Communications, O'Reilly Media, and a member of the board of managers of Rubini Global Economics. A number of other important positions: chairman of the board of trustees of Cambridge in America, board of managers of the Cambridge Endowment for Research and Finance, board of directors, Social Science Research Council, Institute for New Economic Thinking, and a number of other positions. And as I said, author of the 2012 book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, Market Speculation in the State. He received his doctorate in economics from Cambridge and way back in the 60s. So, Bill, thank you for joining us.
Very good to be here, Rob, and I appreciate this opportunity in a kind of Clausewitzian sense to extend my book by other means, and this is one of the other means. But to begin really right where ITIF exists, the book is about how the innovation economy works, how economic development through the deployment of innovative technologies has successively transformed the context in which people go about getting and spending in their economic life. And probably the simplest way to think about this is in terms of three interrelated processes characterized by deep, complex feedback loops, beginning with upstream discovery and invention, culminating downstream in the exploration of new economic space that's created as technologies are deployed at scale. And the first key message is that both of these processes proceed by trial and error and error and error. In between, the technologies that really matter have been those that have been deployed as infrastructure networks, from the canals and railroads of the first industrial revolution through the internet, whose value and use cannot be known at the onset of deployment. The value of one link in a railroad or one node on a network, on an internet network, until you know what the applications are that are going to run over those networks, cannot be evaluated. So not only are these processes, is an economics, neoclassical economics, focused on the efficient allocation of resources by perfectly informed rational agents, a distracting irrelevance for understanding how these processes work. But in fact, historically, they have been dependent on funding from sources that are essentially decoupled from a direct concern with quantifiable economic value. The two institutions, the two sources about which mainstream economics and economists are uncomfortable in dealing are financial speculation and the state. So let me begin with the role of the state. Now, again, it is contrary to almost every one of those four sets of economists, except, well, and even contrary to the Schumpeterian message. For 250 years and more, going back to the 16th century, economic development has been successively and repeatedly driven by state policies of effective mercantilist intervention. Subsidies, protection, support for infant industries, from when the British stole silk-making technology from the Italians and cotton-making technology from the Indians, and the Navigation Acts of the Tudors and the Commonwealth enabled Britain to catch up with and overtake Flanders. One of the great discoveries I had in pursuing the illicit literature on this subject, not taught in any course that I am aware of in the United States, arguably the greatest book in the 19th century on economic development by the German economist Friedrich List, The National System of Political Economy, in which he writes that if Britain had relied on the laissez-faire, had adopted the laissez-faire policies that it championed by the mid-19th century when it was top nation, if it had, then England would have remained the sheepyard for the Flemings. But in any case, when the US and the UK and Germany were pursuing Britain in the 19th century, on to Japan in the 20th century, and the tigers of East Asia, and now China, mercantilist policies of appropriation of intellectual property, protection, and subsidy have been the drivers of economic growth. Now, following Britain's emergence as the first industrial nation some 200 years ago, only the US has succeeded in the enormously challenging task of moving from being an effective follower to a leader at the technological frontier. As I say, the path for followers is very simple and very direct. But going from implementing the policies of protection and national champions to open innovation is extremely difficult. And in fact, those institutions, those corporations that have been the national champions can be the obstacles to innovation at the frontier. Perfect example is the manner in which AT&T, one of the great vehicles of America's technological triumph in the 20th century, fought the development and deployment of the internet every step of the way, for technological reasons, for political reasons, and of course, above all, for economic and financial reasons. The Chinese, I have no doubt, are going to face similar challenges as they achieve the opportunity to move towards the frontier. For the U.S., of course, it was World War II, the mobilization of science for war, and then reciprocally the massive investment of state funding of science. That and the role of the Defense Department not only as a source of funding for research, but as a creative and collaborative customer for the fruits of that research in the semiconductor industry, in the software industry, in the computer industry, broadly defined, that pulled the U.S. to the front. Now, if state investments and state subsidies have been again and again the vehicles for building the infrastructure and creating the potential for economic transformation, it has been financial speculation in the capital markets that has mobilized resources at a scale that would never have been produced by the prudent investments of rational investors. It has been the idea of being able to invest in financial securities and to get out before you have to find out what the economic value that you have been financing really is. That has been the vehicle for mobilizing enormous resources. Now, the first law of bubbles, of financial bubbles, is that they're banal. Wherever there are liquid markets and assets, from tulip bulbs to beach houses in the Nevada desert, there you will find bull runs, manias, speculation. This is the great lesson of all the historical work, and I would certainly, frankly, put Kindleberger above Reinhardt and Rogoff as a source text on this. The financial markets will move to excess. It is the question for all investors at all times is how long can you afford to be wrong? Keynes wrote about how hard it is to be a long-term investor, to hold out against the mob, particularly professional investors who are subject to their investors pulling the money out if they don't chase the wave. But occasionally the object of speculation is one of those technological innovations, from canal mania in the Britain of the 1770s to the dot-com internet bubble of the end of the 20th century. One of those innovations which, when deployed at scale, and when the new opportunities opened up by the deployment of that technology, when those can be funded so that the 1,000 wannabe new hopeful monsters can be created in order to find out where there is an Amazon and eBay and Google. It took 100pets.co in order to get to one Amazon. Again, speculation funds a wasteful process of exploration. And I do think that it's very important to distinguish. It's not just that bubbles get a bad name. They should get a bad name. They always burst. But it's possible to do a little schematic segmentation. And I had a whiteboard in this Roy classroom. It's really simple. You don't need the graphic. But just think of a two-dimensional matrix. And along one axis is the object of speculation. Are they assets that have the potential for increasing productivity, improving the capacity for economic opportunity? Or, as I say, are they tulip bulbs, gold mines, beach houses in the Nevada desert? And along the other axis is the locus, the venue. Where is the speculation taking place? And historically, it does appear to be the case that when the speculation is limited to the liquid financial markets, the stock market, the bond market, the junk bond market, and when the object is one of those innovative productivity enhancing technologies, then when the bubble bursts, there's value left behind and the damage done is relatively limited. On the other hand, when the speculation infects the core banking system that provides working capital to the entire routine economy, and the object of speculation offers no potential for economic enhancement, then the consequences have been from 1825 in Britain to 2008 in the US, catastrophic. And obviously the comparison between both what was delivered by the bubble of 1998-2000 versus what was delivered by the financial speculation and the banking and derivatives markets of 2004, 2007 were radically different, and the consequences of those bubbles bursting were also radically different. Now, as Rob said, I've spent 35 years from when I left academia to when I've returned to academia in the core of venture capital. And the history of venture capital, of US venture capital as a, quote, industry, illustrates exactly what I've been saying. First of all, 80% of all dollars invested by venture capitalists since there was any kind of collective scale post the ERISA reforms of 1979. From 1982 to date, more than 80% of all dollars invested have been in two sectors, the two sectors, information and communications technology and biotech life sciences, where the federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars constructing platforms for entrepreneurs and the venture guys who back them to dance on. Second, the industry as an industry, beginning in the early 1980s and through 2000, 2001, emerged and flourished during the greatest bull market in the history of capitalism, from 1982 to 2001. And the returns earned by venture capitalists, as demonstrated by an enormous literature of empirical economic and financial analysis, the returns have been very closely correlated with the state of the public equity markets in general, and above all, with access to a speculative market for initial public offerings. Post-2001, when the scale of investing had gone through its own inflationary explosion, when we went from less than $10 billion a year being committed to professional venture capital funds to $105 billion in 2000, in 5 years. That's $140 billion today. From then to date, venture capital returns, despite Facebook, despite Twitter, despite Google, have been miserable. They have been less than what you would have earned by putting your money in the NASDAQ index. And you would have had complete liquidity, and you wouldn't have been paying the carry and the fees. Now, standing back from this role of the state and the role of financial speculation in enabling and financing transformational technological innovation, the message is that the processes of innovation generate, accompanied by, and depend upon the toleration of waste. Those trial and error processes, the excessive infrastructure. We built 5 trunk railroad lines between New York and Chicago in order to guarantee that none of them would ever make any money. We obviously grotesquely overbuilt the internet. We funded startups and startups and startups in order to find to feed the Darwinian process of competitive selection as to what actually was going to generate value. And this is what makes this whole area extremely difficult and uncomfortable for mainstream conventional neoclassical economists to address, because it contradicts the doctrine that economics is about the optimal allocation of resources, as if at the point of investment it were possible to know what the returns were going to be and to allocate capital and labor to those investments which would generate the best returns over time. Now, it's well more than 50 years since 2 great economists, 2 very different kinds of economists, both of whom remain active today, Dick Nelson and Ken Arrow, separately identified market failure in the investments that for-profit companies under competitive conditions will make, the investments in research and development that competitive profit-seeking companies will make. They will not invest enough in R&D because they can't capture all the returns, because it's easy to copy and steal, because the uncertainty of the returns, and that consequently there will be less than, quote, the optimal quantum, and in principle, in theoretical economic principle, that rationalizes government investments to supplement and complement what the private sector will invest. But it is in practice that theoretical rationale has proved inadequate in legitimizing state programs of investment. In fact, it exposes the state, it exposes governments to exactly the same criteria of efficient allocation of resources that in the first place cripples the private sector's investment. Look at the attempt in the stimulus bill in 2009 to spread some billions of dollars, relatively modest number of billions of dollars, across an array of hopeful monsters in the sector known as alternative energy, and the enormous embarrassment created by the bankruptcy of Solyndra and A123. This is why, in fact, the Defense Department, while it was providing enormous amounts of funding for research and for facilities, actually played the most effective role in the early days of the IT revolution as a customer, buying product from new companies like Intel and Texas Instruments, even as it was giving research contracts to IBM and AT&T. When the state gets into the business of picking winners, it's subject to exactly the same critique, except it's politically charged. And that's why the guideline of efficient allocation has again and again trumped the observation and the theoretical explanation of why markets will fail in investing enough in R&D. But the pursuit of efficiency not only discourages toleration of the necessary waste on the long-run supply side of the economy, what I would agree with Rob, what I would call Schumpeterian waste, the necessary waste of exploring what technologies will work and what have actually generate economic value. But it also, the pursuit of efficiency encourages the toleration of what I would call the unnecessary waste on the demand side of the economy, the waste that Keynes devoted himself in the general theory to addressing, the waste of unused resources, human and capital, whose marginal productivity is negative as skills atrophy, machines rust when they're not put to work. Because if the government in its investments is held to that same standard of efficiency, on the cost-benefit analysis, what I would call prior restraint on economic investment, will always find it easier to quantify the costs when the benefits are by definition only to be earned in an uncertain future, especially when they will be earned through investment in new technologies. In a high-growth, fully employed economy, more innovative projects will be financed, and the people stranded in the legacy industries will be more rapidly re-employed in the new ones, and very much vice versa. And that's why I would assert that austerity joins efficiency as an enemy of innovation. So let me consider where we are now along three different dimensions. The first is with respect to the state of the macroeconomy, not just in the US, but more generally. And here, Larry Summers, less than 2 months ago, stimulated a conversation, not always polite, that has been taking place in the op-ed pages of various journals, including the Financial Times. A conversation began with him asking a question as to whether, at least over the last couple of decades, we have to take seriously the notion that left on its own, or relatively speaking, left on its own, with a stagnant to contracting public sector, the private sector will suffer from what is known in the trade as secular stagnation. The secular stagnation debate that Larry originated has now extended itself quite broadly. Paul Krugman, unsurprisingly, has jumped in to not only back Summers, but to say, of course, I said it first. And it is the case that the recent economic history from the mid-90s on does clearly include unsustainable generation of aggregate demand from speculatively financed investments that were, in effect, unsustainable as sources of demand, represented by the productive dot-com tech bubble of the late 90s and the unproductive housing bubble of the '80s. And growth has, while return, remains very substantially below capacity. Again, in Europe, at least as much as in the US, more so in Europe, where unemployment, as you know, was reported this morning, is hanging in there, 12.1% across the entire Eurozone. Now, encountering Krugman and Summers, Jeff Sachs, who has his own standing as a controversialist amongst economists, accused Summers of proposing a further federal stimulus of wasteful consumption-led recovery versus a long-term program of investment in productive infrastructure. And again, in my view, missed the essential point. Of course, there are opportunities for investment. Of course, the greening of the infrastructure of the United States and of the developed world would put all unemployed resources fully to work for a long generation. But what is missing is the mission, the politically legitimate mission. Today's equivalent of national development of the 19th century, national security in the 20th century, that would legitimize the kind of investments that Sachs called for. Neither market failure nor even the failure of markets globally have justified in and of themselves the kind of investments required. Famously, Summers invoked Keynes's thought experiment, an impeccable exercise of economic logic, when he wrote in the General Theory that if the British Treasury had taken old beer bottles,
Wine bottles.
beer bottles, I promise you.
Really?
I promise you.
Okay.
I promise you.
All right, fine.
And stuffed them with used banknotes, buried them in abandoned coal mines, piled municipal trash over them, and then, quote, left it to the profit motive of the private sector to dig them up and spend the money. There need be no unemployment. And of course, he said, investment in productive assets would be better, but it would be better to use the beer bottles and to use banknotes than to do nothing at all. And that, of course, characteristically for Keynes, was provocative, was outrageous, and is exactly what Jeff Sachs attacked as representing irresponsible economic policy formation. But it did take what, in fact, was the most wasteful investment imaginable. Mobilization for World War II, beginning in Germany, on to the UK, and then the US, and with Japan along the way, that ended the Great Depression. So the question of where we stand today in the absence across the developed world, outside of the emergent new economies where national development still has the traction that it has in China, for example. In the absence of politically legitimate missions for an economically active public sector, the question of secular stagnation, I think, needs to be taken very seriously. Now, the second dimension of where we are today concerns not the macro economy broadly defined in terms of the national income statistics and real growth measures, but very specifically the innovation economy. And here the stimulus to debate is the really outstanding historian and macroeconomist Bob Gordon at Northwestern, who, again, now about a year ago, wrote a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper called The End of U.S. Growth. Is U.S. growth over? Gordon exemplifies the techno-pessimists, and he does so by a crude, which he admits, a crude comparison of what he calls the first two industrial revolutions. The first one going back to the mid-18th century from steam power through the railroads, and the second beginning with the application of science to industry from electrification through the rise of the chemical industry from roughly 1870 to 1960. And over these respectively enormous escape of more than 100 years, he sees the impact of the third computer digital revolution beginning in 1960 as trivial, as giving us these kinds of things and consumer electronics and some data processing, but compared with what the railroads did, what electrification did, what the transformation of the household, that these are quite trivial and they're over. Well, the first thing to say about that is that if you truncated Gordon's first industrial revolution at only 50 years, if you started with, say, the beginning of construction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway in 1827, 50 years later, Sears Roebuck had not been founded. The killer app of the railroad age, retail mail order, which created national markets and national brands and transformed the economic architecture of all developed economies as they emerged, would not have taken place, would not have happened yet. You would still have had a shoemaker in every town instead of, by 1910, all the shoes in America made in Brockton, Massachusetts. Similarly, if you truncated his second industrial revolution at only 50 years after Edison turned on the Pearl Street station, the first power generation station in 1882, you would have had manufacturing just tilting over to the mass adoption of unit motors and flexible manufacturing lines, which is why, through the Depression, manufacturing productivity rose enormously, because the late followers of the pioneers were forced to adopt efficient manufacturing technology, and you would have had virtually no household appliances. So, in my view, we are very, very early, no more than halfway through, playing out the digital revolution, the transformation of the analog world into which we're born into its digital representations. And we're just entering the fourth generation of computing architectures, the mobile cloud generation, where computing becomes ubiquitous on the one hand and disappears effectively from the concern of mere mortals, takes place around us. It's the environment. It's not anything you have to think about learning how to do. The networks of sensors and actuators known as the Internet of Things is just being defined, hasn't been deployed. the emergence of quasi-autonomous systems, aka robots, aka the Google car, just prototype. Speech recognition is now ubiquitous, but it's morphing over into natural language understanding so that computer systems don't only understand what you say, but can do a better and better job of interpreting what you mean, just beginning to happen. And then finally, as these systems generate data, unstructured data, speech, text, in quantities unimaginable even a decade ago, the extraction of meaningful and actionable information from that data is in its very early days. What the consequences of this are all going to be are as unknowable as what the consequences of the establishment of Railway Express, which made it possible to send packages from Washington to San Francisco without writing down each junction point and train line that they had to move you had to move the package to. That's what enabled mail order. It's unknowable in principle, but it's not over.
3 more minutes, Paul.
Yeah. So while the digital revolution continues its pace, the next new economy, the low carbon economy, is stalled. Now, the U.S., we talk about American exceptionalism, and the U.S. is exceptional in this stage because this is the only political economy in the world where the argument is not about how to respond, how to adapt, resist climate change, where the debate rather is about whether or not it exists at all. And my simple response on this front is to note that those who reject any role for government in the context of climate change, global warming, etc., and I appreciate that it can be challenging to think about global warming on a day like this, but whether they reject policy discussion, policy debate, because they deny the science, or whether they deny the science because to accept it would legitimize an economically active role for government. So the final point, let me conclude, because it's easy in my view to get extremely pessimistic about where we stand, particularly sitting in Washington, particularly having spent yesterday chatting with friends on the Hill. But I myself cannot end on a pessimistic note. The guy who hired me at Warburg Pincus 25 years ago used to say that you can't survive as a venture capitalist if you're a pessimist, because you just slit your throat when you look at all the troubles and failures that go with making successful investments. And here, I think among the consequences of the global financial crisis of '08 and the Great Recession, or the Lesser Depression, as Brad DeLong calls it, that followed, there's one enormously positive consequence, and that was the impact on the disciplines of finance and economics, which confronted economists with that classic question: what are you going to believe? Are you going to believe in efficient markets and rational expectations, or in your lying eyes, which are looking at market failure and dislocation and incoherence across the economies? I think that the notion of economics as the study of coordination failure in a monetary market economy where Say's law does not hold, where supply does not create its own demand, is beginning to gain traction in the academy. It's what we're devoted to proposing and promoting at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And the recognition that financial markets not only are not efficient, but are necessarily subject to bubbles and crashes, momentum investing, herding behavior, it again has begun to pervade the system, and that diverse and intensive efforts to address the realities of market life are underway, accompanied by the reintegration of economics and finance into the one discipline that was broken apart some 30 or 40 years ago with finance in the business schools and economists excluding consideration of money and credit from the dynamics of micro markets or the macro economy. So from my perspective, I myself had not expected to live long enough for the economics I learned from Keynes' students at Cambridge 50 years ago, again, to be so relevant as they are today. And with that, I thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Well, Bill, that was wonderful. Let me make a couple of observations and then a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. There's a wonderful line from Schumpeter we quote in our book, which I, of course, can't remember exactly, but it's something along the lines of a kind of an economy that is efficient at every particular point in time, but it is less optimal than an economy that is not efficient because it's about dynamic disruption. Right. And that's, I think, really the core of what you're saying to me is this sort of fixation on allocation efficiency of these two lines we all study in micro, these things happening. That really is not the right way to think about an economy. The way we should be thinking about an economy is how do we actually get disruption
and survive disruption. Yeah. There's a footnote in Schumpeter. Schumpeter was extremely, almost as much as his Viennese younger quasi-contemporaries, von Mises and Hayek, was very resistant to any kind of role for government in any of this. That it was one of the sources of the notion that the only economic role for government is to screw up markets. And in his case was to slow down the process of disruption. But there is a footnote. There is a footnote in Business Cycles in which Schumpeter agrees that it's possible for the private sector to enter a vortex, his term, of self-reinforcing contraction, where only government can intervene. But it's only a footnote. It's only a footnote. Actually, given your deep knowledge of Schumpeter, I'd almost like to turn the tables on you a bit. One of the themes that I've been pursuing in sponsoring economic research is to understand and to mobilize the two different versions of Schumpeter. So Schumpeter Mark 1, which goes all the way back to the start of his career, is that innovation is driven by new companies, by startups, by new entrepreneurs who attack the established companies with more lower cost, more productive processes, not necessarily products, and drive them out. But by the end of his career, in his last book, written during World War II, he kind of tosses in the towel. And he actually uses the term that innovation has been reduced to a bureaucratic routine, and that the large established enterprise, and again this is a quote, ousts the entrepreneur. Now, when we look back, we can look at different industrial sectors, and we can see some, like the heavy process industries, like chemicals, where by and large, not exclusively, by and large, innovation has come from the DuPonts, the GE Plastics, the Siemens, Hoechst, and such, and where the sheer scale of capital investment required, as in the alternative energy industries, where venture capitalists pissed away several $1 billion in the mid-aughties, trying to play the game from ethanol to more technologically efficient approaches to alternative energy. No place for a startup. When the return, when a unit is $1 billion and it's multiple units to get to production scale, and when the return is 10, 20 years out, no place for a venture capitalist. And on the other, in the world created by the Defense Department and the world of IT, of course, there's been startups that have repeatedly had a transformational impact and continue to do so. Google begins with an NSF research grant and produces the most, arguably the most significant company of the 21st century to date. So I think that dynamic between where innovation resides is largely, it's a function of technological characteristics, capital, financial characteristics, and has been virtually unstudied by economists, historians. Historians have spent more time with it. Economists have spent almost no time with it. Yeah. And I think, given your position, and this is a challenge to you, I think that for ITIF, this is a really interesting topic. Yeah. And it's very different kinds of policies. The other issue, which Schumpeter doesn't really address, is the ownership of intellectual property. One of the dirty secrets of the foundation years of the IT revolution is that the Defense Department didn't just sponsor, it required what today would be considered a scandalously open intellectual property regime. First of all, software couldn't be patented at all. But even in the world of semiconductors and computers, where patents were available, if the patent was developed with government money, the government insisted on fair, open, low-cost licensing across the industry. And if what was produced with the patent really mattered, the government insisted that the supplier put a second source into production as a failover fallback, legitimized, of course, because the requirements were national security, not economic efficiency. I think one of the questions we have today, and this is one that has been subject of a lot of academic research, is whether the patent system has crossed the chasm to become actually a burden and a tax on innovation rather than an enabler of innovation by allowing the inventor to capture returns. Yeah. I think it's a really important issue, public policy issue.
There's a new piece we have coming out. We've written a little bit on it recently, but that looks at this question. And I think if Schumpeter were talking about this, he would argue it's an inverted U.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And
question, where are we on the U? And
right.
The problem I have debate is that people tend to want to be on either side of that, and some people make vast claims that everything should be open, everything should be in the public domain, and it doesn't get you there either.
And with the rise of the open source movement, which in a way is a real throwback, the great historian of technology Joel Moker argues that the original Industrial Revolution was really an open source movement, and before there was any kind of protection for intellectual property going back to the 17th century. But it is the case that all of the really successful open source innovations have actually been copies of proprietary original inventions that were protected by patent.
Although I just finished Why Nations Fail over the holidays, and he was talking about James Watt, and his ability to get a patent from the Crown and how that enables. So I think Moker's story is a little bit more complicated.
That Watt patent, and this is something that Darren missed, for 20 years, Watt and his partner took to court anybody who produced any kind of steam engine and arguably slowed down the first industrial revolution by 20 years. It wasn't until the patent expired that steam engines went from being only able to do this, pump water out of mills, to do this, drive railroad locomotives. So the patent was a major blockage to innovation.
We should have that's a whole other, we could go down that path, but I want to raise two other issues. One was I recently wrote a blog or an op-ed critiquing Peter Thiel, who I think you know, one of the founders of PayPal, and libertarian. And Peter was arguing that the reason we don't have innovation, or we don't have enough innovation, was largely because of the heavy hand of government. And I argued in contrast, it was that the fact that the government has not been adding to what I call the mountain of knowledge that entrepreneurs mine from. They go into this mountain, instead of knowledge and infrastructures, they mine from them. And to me, what's striking about this, and you've alluded to it in your book, was just the important role of the federal government. There's a statistic we've used that in the 1960s, the U.S. federal government funded more research than the entire world did, public and private.
Yeah.
And that is just such an amazing advantage, a lead, if you will, We just released a report yesterday that my colleague Joe Kennedy helped with on an innovation-based budget approach, where we argued that that austerity is an enemy here, and that to address the budget, you have to dig the hole deeper by $50 billion more in federal R&D support, a better R&D tax credit. And so I think that there's that whole sort of confusion there about the role of sort of public knowledge, if you will, that entrepreneurs.
Right. I'd extend it in another direction. As I said, when the federal government was, and from 1953 to 1978, the federal government was more than half of all U.S. R&D spending for those 25 years. And of course, that included the NIH, which went from a marginal institution to Nixon's declaration of war on cancer. And by invoking war, that means it's not subject to cost-benefit analysis. We're going to spend whatever it takes. And again, that was done with a relatively open intellectual property context before the Supreme Court said you could patent genes, from which they're now backing off. But one of the contested issues, and really contested in the academy, is the role of the Bayh-Dole Act. So Bayh-Dole said, contrary to what had been public policy, that a university that received federal funding for research could patent and license the output of that research, the innovations, the inventions generated from that research. Now, on the one hand, a lot of literature to confirm that an enormous number of startup companies, not all life sciences, many of them life science companies, were launched because the university got a patent and assigned it to a startup company that otherwise wouldn't exist. On the other hand, in terms of the mountain of knowledge, prior to that, that technology, and some of this fundamental technology, like the famous Axel patents at Columbia that generated $500 million of funding, of royalties for Columbia, were licensed very broadly. These were the patents that enabled genetic engineering in mammalian cells. The original Nobel Prizes were for bacteria, but this is the mammalian, what brought biotechnology into creatures like us. But there is a question, and there has been work done, that it has diverted, just as in corporate world, the rise of the stockholder value as the only metric of performance, which means necessarily a shortening of the time horizon since stockholders can sell the stock, and which led to shift of R&D resources from upstream, basic, primary science to very applied projects. And one of the questions, whether something like that has happened in the research universities as a consequence of the incentives. And economists correctly like to talk about behavior responding to incentives. And when you give universities the incentive of being able to patent and license and make money from the research work, it almost would be kind of surprising if there weren't a shift in focus from what contributes to that broadly available mountain of knowledge into a more narrowly appropriatable application of the knowledge.
So we should just do this all day, because we can have conversations on this, because I think one of the things, by the way, that makes that more complicated now is that the U.S. had the luxury of being essentially the knowledge public good provider for the world. We didn't have real competitors in that sense, maybe Germany and a few others. Today we don't, and I think there's an argument one could make that we've got to think about a balance, that we can't go too far towards basic and too far towards development, because if we go too far towards basic, then we're providing a public good for the rest of the world.
That's right.
So it's a balance there. One last point, you mentioned Arrow and Nelson, and Richard Nelson is a hero of mine, but certainly somebody I've read extensively and have unbelievable respect for all his work and the contributions he's made. What is striking to me today in Washington, how I think no one remembers Arrow and Nelson anymore, because there is a uniform view that we should abolish, not uniform, there's a growing view we should abolish the research and development tax credit. And I think the odds of that happening are certainly real in corporate tax reform.
Mhm.
And whenever I debate that, and in fact I'm debating Marty Sullivan sometime in February, a leading author of at Tax Notes Journal, on this point. Whenever I debate that with anybody, I say, Arrow Nelson made this point. What is different today? Has this theory and evidence been rebutted? No, it hasn't.
Right, I agree.
And yet, we seem to have forgotten that.
Well, I think it does go with the notion which remains, it took a generation from World War II through the 70s for the market fundamentalists to establish a sufficient base politically and intellectually and culturally so that when the first oil shock paralyzed governments, drove markets by radically increasing costs and shifting resources from high consumption to low consumption, Middle East economy, and therefore resulted in simultaneously increasing unemployment and increasing inflation, which was then discredited the post-war economics and opened the door that, as I say, the only economic role for government is to screw up efficient markets, and if we just leave the markets free to choose, as Milton Friedman famously put it, everything will be the best in the best of all possible worlds. And I think it's going to take a generation from 2008. I think we're making progress on various fronts in the academy. But the last sentence of the general theory, where Keynes speaks of how practical businessmen, like politicians who hear voices in the air, are acting out the teachings of some defunct economist of generations before. But sooner or later, it is ideas, not interests, that are powerful for good or evil.
Yeah.
And there are ideas evolving in response. And one of the catchphrases is that new economic thinking often consists of reading old economics books.
I could keep going for a long, long time, but I want to open it up for folks here. So if you have a comment or a question, and you want to go here, here, and here. So right here.
Yeah.
Okay, I resonate with your problems with efficient allocation for companies, and as Rob hinted at, it's a problem now for countries as well as companies, because it's hard to benefit from the results that you invest in, unpredictable as they are. The thing that's really important to me, and it seems to you, is the customer. The success of the DoD allocation model was they were the customer.
Yeah.
And as always, if you looked at various economic models, this 10, 100, 1,000 orders of magnitude, the amount you put in research has to match somehow an order of magnitude more that you're willing to invest in development to match another order of magnitude more that you have in a customer base, either in the market. And it was interesting. I can't find it. I've hunted for the New York Times op-ed, I think in the 70s, by some Russian general. Maybe it's later. Probably had to do at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, who had that same allocation model for the Russian military and where they spent their money and all. So what is the outlook for finding a customer
And it's very
drive? You can't really, no way you can convince a politician you can create this infrastructure or make this investment unless you have the customer at the end.
well. Two responses to that. Excellent question. First is perhaps to reinforce the conundrum. There's a wonderful guy who's been resident in this town for many, many years, who's MIT's representative, Bill Bonvillian.
Bill is on our board.
Well, Bill and a colleague wrote a really interesting article a year or so ago comparing, I'm sure you know it well, comparing DARPA and ARPA-E and the enormous impact of DARPA and the limited impact of ARPA-E. And one of the things, they point out two institutional facts. The first is that DARPA had these big brothers that it could pass innovation over to, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, who were the customers. Although the history of the internet kind of actually sort of compromises that a little bit. It's very interesting how the commercial market picked up on the internet very rapidly, although very primitively for the first 10 years or so. But nonetheless, it had these big customers that it was serving, whereas RPE doesn't. So if you have next generation solar cells, next generation battery technology, there isn't a kind of organic relationship. And the second is that DARPA, and more broadly the Defense Department, and the digital technologies were not addressing a massive incumbent industry committed to a prior generation of technology. In fact, that prior generation was IBM, and Tom Watson Jr. convinced his father that they had to join the revolution rather than resist the revolution. They had to go from punch cards and electromechanical accounting machines to the digital electronics of the new age, and did that by the 1950s. Whereas, obviously, any innovative energy technologies is facing the largest industry in the world, some elements of which are trying at least to hedge their bets, but others of which are profoundly resistant. I give you the American Coal Institute. So those represent huge challenges. On the other hand, were there to be that mission, and maybe, I sometimes think that we can think about, we know there will be, not a Sputnik moment, there'll be a Pearl Harbor moment. But of course, we're talking about irreversible processes. At some point, when we lose the Greenland ice cap, Palm Beach will be under a meter of water. The descendants of the Koch brothers will be in Washington demanding government intervention, just as after Pearl Harbor, the country consolidated around it. The problem is that's probably still 50 to 60 years away. In the meantime, whether and how climate change becomes a legitimizing rationale whereby the customer are all the customers for the same kind of outputs but generated by radically more efficient modes of production and distribution. I don't know how that happens. I did have a really interesting conversation yesterday with the kind of member of Congress, the kind of member of the United States Senate who gives one heart and hope, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, who told me that he doesn't, when he's back home, and of course he's in a progressive state, but he doesn't talk about global warming. He talks about the beetles that used to die off over the winter, but today survive from year to year and are devastating the Oregon forests. And in the conservative right-wing sections of the state, away from Portland and Salem, people start nodding their heads. So it may be that we find the customers, and again in the Washington tradition, invoking Tip O'Neill's dictum that all politics is local, and that it's climate change locally that will enable the political consensus that can remobilize Nelson and Arrow, but at scale.
I'm sorry, we got a lot of people talking, maybe we can do that. I want to make sure we get enough time for everybody to jump in, so yeah.
On the question of optimization and efficiency, as a former physicist, I've always found dollars a much less satisfying units than ohms and wave numbers and things like that. And in your new economic thinking stuff, there's an effort to try to broaden economics beyond optimizing dollars. Could you talk about that?
Well, first, I'm not. The new economic, the span of what constitutes new economic thinking is obviously something of it's open to an enormously broad and diverse debate. There's a school of what are known as econophysicists who actually their contribution, it's not so much to go from dollars to physical processes. It's to recognize that the physical processes are complex, evolving, emergent systems. It's the Santa Fe Institute vision of the complex system whose behavior emerges, and attempting to capture some of that. The fellow who runs our INET Institute at Oxford, Eric Beinhocker, wrote a book about complexity economics. Brian Arthur has written a wonderful article summarizing what is meant by complexity economics. And this does kind of, it's not talking about a different, in a way it's saying, it's taking the notion of optimization, it's moving economic analysis further from the notion of optimization, while recognizing that the specific, each process can be optimized, but the interaction of them has consequences that in principle are not predictable. So clearly, having a building that gives off less heat and uses fuel more efficiently is an economic good. But trying to decide in advance what technology 20 or 30 years from now is going to enable that versus having multiple shots on goal, knowing we're going to write off that some of the money will be wasted, fits entirely with, is entirely compatible with the notion of technical efficiency at the deployed level once we find out what actually works by trial and error.
Yes, sir. Right here. I'm going to go in order I see him, so go ahead. Yeah.
Cheers. Just an observation and a question. The observation is, the uncertainty, the waste you talk of, when a person is really operating under heightened uncertainty and they don't know what they're going after, we call it learning.
Yeah, that's good.
And I think that this, the way we talk about this can matter insofar as you're talking about under heightened uncertainty. I think a wide spectrum, a buckshot versus bullet approach tends to make sense. You get a wider distribution of activities, you're more likely to have a hit. So maybe how we talk about that would be an interesting discussion. The question I have is, you talk about, from Ken Arrow, just because we have a rationale for, state funding of R&D does not necessarily legitimize that state role. And I think the question I have, you brought up, Rob, Why Nations Fail, which is a fascinating book, and I think you can bring these two together. I think the question of how that is legitimated is a really interesting question. In Why Nations Fail, I'm going to do a horrible job paraphrasing, but Darren Acemoglu talks about how you have sort of new disruptors, but they're extracting in some amount, but they're widening the access to the resources of that society. So you have extractive communities that either keep it narrow, or new communities that are also extracting but widen the benefit of it. And so the question in my mind becomes sort of the equity dimension of those investments. With the railroads, the state gave a lot of land to the railroads, right? With electrification, we got regulated monopolies. You still have these aspects of what a negative interpretation would be is crony capitalism, but at the same time, the history of these major innovative infrastructures you point out is very much these handshakes or crony relationships.
Two things. First, on the book, on Acemoglu and Robinson's book, my own view is it takes a much too simple point of view in going from political inclusiveness to economic inclusiveness, and economic inclusiveness thereby enabling innovation. It has a very simple linear process. I think if you look back at British history and American history, it ain't that simple. And if you look at China today, is where you have a politically extractive, non-inclusive culture, but an economic one that is broadening and creating economic wealth and financial wealth at a scale never before known. Which is going to drive which? I can tell a story, and I do when I'm in China, about Britain in 1820, when you have a country that's ruled by a corrupt oligarchy that's exercising authority across the nation in collaboration with a national religious establishment, and that locally the religious establishment and the local power centers together can do anything they want, and they're trying to hold the lid, legitimized by looking over their shoulder at chaos and anarchy and terror just within living memory, just across the channel. They're trying to hold the lid on the greatest explosion of economic energy and financial wealth in the history of humankind. The Chinese don't need a lot of help in getting the metaphor. So which drive the British political system opened up? Between 1820 and 1860, you go from Cobbett's old corruption to the Trollopian world of high Victorian rectitude in public office. Which drove which? And I think that's an open question that Asimago and Robinson don't appropriately address. But I think it's a very relevant question in looking at where, and the same kind of thing happened in Korea. Korea was a dictatorship. My former partner, now retired, Howard Brown, when he was Secretary of Defense, had to go to Seoul and personally intervene with the President of the Republic in order to save the life of the next president but two, who was about to be executed. But it was this enormous economic explosion channeled through state and state-sponsored chaebol that fed back, and Korea is now a working democracy. Which came first?
So I'm going to go in order on some. Michael, and Michael, we could have easily had you up on here on the panel given your wonderful book.
I have a question, not a statement.
Okay.
Although I'm glad you mentioned Friedrich List. I own his magnum opus.
Good for you.
And I think, Rob, you're going to have to add Listian to your economic personality.
That's right.
Well, here's my suggestion. You're looking, I think what you more than anyone else, you've introduced this idea of a mission into innovation. You've emphasized, as others have, the need for having government procurement or a big customer. And I would suggest that you think about medicine as well as energy. Mm-hmm. The Medicaid and Medicare, a third of the budget apiece, federal budget, like defense. Unlike defense, they're responsible for half of all spending on medicine in the United States. Vastly greater than the defense share of the industrial economy ever was. For political reasons, they are banned from using their monopsony power.
You're absolutely right.
In the way the Defense Department did. At least in theory they couldn't they?
I agree entirely. And I must say, I spent half my life in subject to the death panels of the National Health System in Britain. And I can't tell you what a joy it is to be getting medical care in Britain compared with even being a platinum insured private patient in New York. I entirely agree with you, Michael, and I think that has to evolve over maybe a decade or two. The idea that Medicare can't negotiate for drug prices it's an outrage. And
but I would go beyond that. You could have like an ARPA-M or something where it actually, instead of simply being seen as a terrible thing that we must cut because of the budget, see it as something that can play a creative role in setting standards, regulatory innovation, for example.
I agree.
Right back here.
Well, first of all, thank you for a fascinating presentation. My name is Al Watkins. I spent 25 years working at the World Bank. Now I'm doing some work, again, in emerging markets, trying to sort of promote transfer of technology from where it's been developed to emerging markets. And so one of your, and by emerging markets, I'm not talking only India, China, and Brazil, but Africa, Laos, those sorts of places. You were talking about, for example, in energy, the whole issue of vested interests in the United States blocking this sort of move to a green economy. But then if you go to emerging markets where there's energy access is the issue, the vested interests, never would say there are no vested interests in emerging markets, but the vested interests are different, and there's opportunities to deploy technology in ways that leapfrogging, just the way cell phones are.
I was just going to say, exactly right, in the telecommunications infrastructure, nobody is going to string wires across Africa. And the manner in which mobile devices have become enablers of services such as banking, such as payment systems, credit systems, is the follower enough further behind has an opportunity to leapfrog and get at least towards the frontier in application, not necessarily in the invention, but in the application, and that in turn provides feedback. All of these processes are complex feedback processes. So that innovation in turn, in application, can create a demand for evolving the technology in a way that's responsive to it. I would urge you to take a look at work of a really great scholar, Tim Bresnahan at Stanford, who's done a lot of work on what are called GPTs, general purpose technologies, steam engine, electricity, digital computing, and how the core technology is shaped by the innovative applications which more or less randomly take off and pull the core, provide an incentive for advancing the core in a particular direction. And I think what's going on in Africa in particular, in the use of mobile systems, is going to feed back and may play a role in leading how the next generation of mobile systems evolve.
And I would go beyond just, I agree with you completely on the mobile systems, but if you think about the delivery of clean drinking water, if you think about healthcare, if you want to talk about bending the cost curve, look at some of the low-cost innovations which are producing very high-quality outcomes at a fraction.
Great. Now I want to move on. By the way, if you're interested more in Breslin had done good work on that. There are other economists as well. If you go on our website and just type in GPT, there's a lot of work we've written on GPTs. Yeah. And, Bill, part of this thing is, neoclassical economists don't believe in GPTs. Right. There's that famous phrase, supposedly by Michael Boskin, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? Yeah. Which is essentially a rejection.
The Jesuits have a phrase known as, that there are people who are subject to invincible ignorance. I think it was a good question.
Bill, if I understand what you said correctly and oversimplify it, you've said that what we wait 50 years or several decades for the climate tipping point, or for the Affordable Care Act to no longer give government intervention in the medical economy a bad name. We have tremendous opportunities, contrary to Bob Gordon, in the digital revolution, but that depends hugely on what you call wasteful financial speculation. And I didn't hear enough about what you think the future of wasteful financial speculation is and what the public policy implications of that are.
First, I do want to make a distinction because I think you conflated two things, Steve. One is I'm saying that in the private sector, there is a lot of momentum in carrying forward the digital technologies and the application of the digital technologies. And it doesn't need a lot of further government support, either as customer or as research funder, for that to continue to take place. And episodically, as with the social media companies, you'll see speculation emerge, not system-wide, but around one or more of these things that takes off. So I'm sure there's going to be, just as with the electric car even, with around Elon Musk, I think that the natural language understanding technologies emerge and are applied. There's going to be some speculation about, people who, when they were children, will tell their children about the computer in 2001, and it, finally does exist. And it's about, on the other hand, it is about the green, clean response to climate change technologies that I'm concerned, because there's an enormous amount of science that needs to be done. Not much of which I think is going to be done in the private sector. All those electric cars depend on advances in battery technology. And if you look at all the things that measure the advances in the digital technologies, from Moore's law to bandwidth to memory capacity, and then you look at the improvement in the energy density of batteries, it's flat. Just tiny, tiny, tiny advances. There's an enormous amount of work and that's going to be early fundamental science, and it's going to be funded it's not going to be funded by private companies at any significant scale. And that's where, yes, a mission is required. And I would hope that as I say, I think much, not all, because you have at least as many elements in the coalition that blocks discussion of how to respond to climate change. You do have market fundamentalists. You do have creationists. I'm minded of when in 2010, the head of one of our great public research institutions, will go nameless, was invited to meet the new chairman of the House Energy Committee and the House Science Subcommittee, and they said to him, and I quote, look, here's what you need to know. First of all, we get it. We understand that all this talk about global warming is part of a socialist plot to take over our lives. But second, what you need to get is that as far as we're concerned, it doesn't matter. Because if it happens, it's God's will. So that invincible ignorance is there. But then there are the others who are, more narrowly self-interested, are more subject to learning that once upon a time there was, and once upon a time there may be again, roles for government that actually are productive and are effective, not necessarily efficient. And that I hope, I don't expect to live long enough to see the Greenland ice cap disappear, but I hope to live long enough for this country to join the coalition of the conscious about what in fact is going on and how public sector, private sector collaboration is necessary to respond to it.
Can I just follow up?
I need to, we got two more questions, sorry. But I do want to respect everybody, so we'll go here and then Cam and then we'll be done. Yeah, yes ma'am.
I'd like to mention, the part you slightly mentioned about the number of the startups, which it can, in certain sector of the industry, it can help economy, but as well as can harm the, just like the market. The numbers increases can drain the big industries and practically is not healthy. If you would like to create a model, risk model for that part, a sector of technology, which factors would you consider and how you decide in the free market how to put all these factors together in order to help the economy and to go ahead?
Well, first of all, I don't think I really agree with your first premise. I think that people who lead big companies and start new companies, while most of their efforts will fail, so that they will be wasteful in a sense, nonetheless, are doing so, are leaving the big companies because it's very hard to drive innovation inside a big company. The bureaucratic routines, the fact, it's not necessarily because the innovation is going to challenge. This did happen with IBM, and people left IBM in the 1980s because they were making so much money over their proprietary systems they wouldn't invest in the new open computing systems. But on the other hand, Xerox's problem wasn't that what was going on at Xerox PARC was going to undercut the profits of the copier business. It's because the copier business was such a great business that any business plan for a startup looked ridiculous to the finance guys. It was much too risky. So people had to leave to start Adobe and 3Com, etc. It was a business problem issue. So I think that process doesn't need a lot of help. I mean, I think it continues. What does, however, where I do, and I've written about this in a number of places, and I did write about it in the book, the activity of financing those startups actually assumes a certain chain that, particularly where in the core technologies, in the really deep technologies, real money is needed. It assumes that there are upside opportunities, winning the lottery, sufficiently great that if they happen, and typically that means by means of a public offering of securities and a company becoming a public company, which is a payoff for the investors, even when the project, the company itself, does not necessarily turn into Google. The ability to get out before you find out what it's worth mobilizes capital at a much larger scale. When the IPO market contracts, goes cold, speculators who are financial speculators, not deep technology investors, disappear. And that feeds back all the way down the chain to reduce the amount of funding for those startups. One reason why, in fact, perhaps the reason why, social media has been so hot is that it costs nothing to get started. As I say to the kids when I'm lecturing at Cambridge and Princeton, you guys don't even need, you young men and women, you can do the startup on your own credit card. You don't even need your parents' credit card. There's open source software, you can rent some cycles from Amazon, you put it up on the net and you see whether anybody bites, and if they do, then you can raise some money because you've got eyeballs. But that's very derivative innovation. Snapchat is truly derivative. The fundamental technology does suffer when you don't have that feedback mission. And the final point, I'm sorry for going on too long, final point is I know the people who were the enormously creative and successful lobbyists for the Jobs Act. I think at one level, the kind of, more or less minor league crowdfunding, making that possible. Yeah, that's no harm, no foul. Some relatively trivial startups will get funded that might not otherwise, and one or more of them may actually turn into something that has traction. I do worry a lot about exempting emerging companies defined as companies with revenues of less than $1 billion from any reducing their reporting requirements. I'm not old enough to remember when the Securities Acts were passed, but I did write my PhD thesis on 1929 to 31, and the Securities Acts were passed for really good reason. And the time to scandal from relieving public companies of reporting discipline will not be very long. So I worry about that aspect of it.
So we're 15 seconds before we have to stop, so we'll extend our time by a couple of minutes. So Cam, do you want to?
Thank you. Thank you for arranging so lucidly over a lot of things. I wanted to come back to the discussion about Bayh-Dole and its impact on innovation incentives. Rob's innovation economics focuses, I think quite rightly, on the impact, particularly of MIT, on the Massachusetts economy and the number of successful companies that it has spawned over a long period of time.
Yeah.
A lot of that has been generated by MIT's emphasis on applied science, and by even pre-Bayh-Dole, an IP commercialization program that really has been a prototype for the commercialization programs at a lot of research universities. So I wanted to sort of explore further, is whether that's a perverse incentive, or what has changed if that's the case.
I think it's really, it's a subject of study. I don't have a strongly held view one way or the other. I do note that there was an awful lot of, that the research university as a channel for fundamental science and applied science, after all, it's relatively a very new invention. If you go back, you were talking about Germany, if you go back 100 years and you were trying to bet on who was going to take over from the Brits, you probably would have bet on Germany. They invented the research university, the first science-based industry, the chemical industry was almost entirely German. And then, of course, they had the worst 50 years imaginable, any country in the world. But learning how the dynamics of the research university plays out in an evolving political environment where the role of the state, on which it's funding largely, not entirely, because you have philanthropic funding. We're discovering what venture philanthropy is and how it plays in, and the extent to which philanthropists claim an active role, and they do, in nudging, if not directing, research priorities, including in universities. I think it's a very open and still, in the great scheme of things, relatively early set of institutional innovations. It does go with what I think is a very profound change, and that is how over the last, say, 30 to 40 years in the US, and just the last 10 or 15 years in Britain, the notion of higher education, from being a public good, which in the US, of course, we pioneered with the Morrill Act in 1862, to being a private asset, the recipients of which, the owners of which, should pay for the privilege, and the role of the state as being responsible for higher education essentially withdrawing. The consequences of that, I think, we're still, are to be determined, and will interact with the research role. I mean, I'm living with this very actively right now in Cambridge, where we're working to catch up with what's happened at the University of Michigan, at Berkeley, at Chapel Hill, etc., for good or ill.
So, just on that note, if we want to dig down deeper into that exact question, ITIF is holding an event up in Cannon House Office Building on January 28th, and on the role of university industry research partnerships, which is going to explore issues around intellectual property, university invention management, and all of that. So
terrific.
I
wish I could attend, but I'll be teaching on the other side. I look forward to the proceedings there.
There will be a video. And then I am definitely with you, Bill. I think we're only about halfway through the IT revolution. That's about right. And I think you nailed exactly some of the big drivers of where we're going to go next. But one of them clearly is big data or data innovation. So I would just add a commercial. We're holding our second annual Data Innovation Day. It's actually now a global event, but here in DC we're going to be doing a day-long event on January 23rd up at the Reserve Officers Club. We have really some of the world's, or certainly the U.S. leading data innovators will be coming and presenting, and we're also going to have a sort of a display thing where we've got about 15 leading data innovation companies will be displaying their wares and how they're doing this and all, as well as what the government is doing in that. So that's on January 23rd. As I said, I'm serious. I could do this because I'm an innovation wonk. I could do this all day, but I really enjoyed this, and I hope you did as well. So please join me in thanking wonderful people.